Keep it simple. A friend used to say to me when we were talking about sermons and about how to present the faith, just help people to get the core idea. Isn't that really what counts? My friend would have loved the gospel lesson for today. Teacher, the Pharisee said, which commandment of the law is the greatest? Give us the core. The Pharisee lawyer types know there are 600 laws, but they want to know what the main one is. And Jesus laid it on the line. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. The beloved Shema Jews have been reciting for centuries. That's the heart of it all. And everybody nodded their heads. But he didn't stop there. He went on to say the second one is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Putting those two together was brand new. You can't do one without the other, Jesus was saying. To love God means to love your neighbor. Our Old Testament friend, Walter Brueggemann, who was with us last spring, says you can't say love God without meaning also love neighbor. In fact, it's all one thing. We should say, love your God neighbor. It's all one. Today at Trinity, we're putting our minds and hearts together for some serious neighbor love work. In the forum hour, just following this, 4 members of Trinity's Anti-Racism Task Force will present a very significant report on the role of race in Trinity Church's history, reaching all the way back to its founding. It's a study of the ways that this mostly white church responded to maybe the greatest ethical challenge in our nation's history. I remember some years ago hearing Condoleezza Rice speak of slavery and racism as our nation's birth defect. The new nation conceived in liberty was also deeply flawed in failing to ascribe full dignity and citizenship to its African American slaves. Many have called slavery America's original sin, an evil from way back that continues to be alive in the form of racism, to linger and corrupt our life, and it seems to be impossible to shake. The authors of this report explore the ways that a set of racial prejudices and assumptions became linked to the structures of political and social power in our country, in the city, and in the churches too. And it resulted in handing virtually every opportunity and privilege to whites and utterly subjugating the African Americans who have been torn from their homeland and thrust into this oppressive new world. It's a story of moral blindness that is hard for many of us to imagine, except that the consequences of it are so apparent and unrelenting. I'll never forget some 10 years ago traveling with a group of Trinity parishioners down to New York City to visit St. Paul's Community Church in East Brooklyn. We met that great preacher, Johnny Ray Youngblood, who welcomed us in, who showed us in our experience there something we had not imagined before. Each year, his congregation performed what they call the Ma'afa Suite, a brilliantly staged musical psychodrama depicting the capture, enslavement, and survival of millions of African Americans in the years of the slave trade. Ma'afa means the middle passage, and its immensely powerful enactment of the horrific events and the struggle of the victims to survive was utterly searing. It was a story that would have been utterly bleak, but for, at the same time, their telling of the Ma'afa was a tale of a God who never gave up on staying with them, suffering with them, giving them the courage to survive. The motto of Ma'afa was simple: the way out is back through. My guess is that that's a pretty good way to describe the reality. They could not move forward without regularly going back to remember what had happened and gather their courage and their faith to go forward. My guess is the same motive is there. The way out is back through was part of a film that came out last year. Many of you probably saw the film 12 Years a Slave. It was a film that won many awards, was greatly praised, but was amazingly painful to watch. The only way really to deal with the reality of slavery, these people seem to be saying, is to face it, to look at its unspeakable ugliness. I confess in watching this searingly brutal film that I was continually casting my eyes down and away and trying not even to listen as the beatings went on and on. But I knew I was facing a truth about our society that can't be avoided. We have to remember again and again what has brought our society here. The way out is back through. This report from our anti-racism team doesn't appear out of thin air. We just didn't make up this great idea. Our Episcopal Church has committed itself to a journey of repentance for the ways our Episcopal forebears participated in and benefited from slavery and racism. Our General Convention has called on dioceses and parish churches to explore and seek to understand their part in the 400-year story of racism and slavery in our church. The ways our communities were complicit in slavery, in segregation, in discrimination, and the ways our churches benefited from the transatlantic slave trade and those 250 years of slavery. But they also asked our church communities to bring forward the times our churches stood up to slavery, stood up to discrimination and injustice. Have you noticed that often when we say the confession in our Eucharist, we pray this line, and we will today: we confess the evil we have done and the evil done on our behalf. That's really what this report is about, putting flesh on those words. Today we are loving our God neighbor by taking a hard look at the evil done on our behalf. A crotchety friend of mine has nagged me in the past about this particular line. I don't get this evil done on our behalf, he says. So what evil exactly have I done? Well, I have plenty of answers for that. But for today, let me say, I'm the product of a middle-class family in the Deep South, which is a society that was built on the backs of slaves and was sustained on the backs of the victims of Jim Crow segregation laws, brutal tenant farming, and racial prejudice so thick that only the very few churches and ministers were courageous enough to challenge it at all. And when I moved years later to the brilliant progressive city of Boston, I began to learn another story of the other ways that destructive racism can work and manifest itself. Evil has been done on my behalf, for sure. And as we gaze at the plight of our African American brothers and sisters in this country, the legacy of racism is staggering. The U.S. today has a greater wealth gap by race than South Africa did during apartheid. 1/3 of African American men in their 30s have been imprisoned at some point. The average black household in the U.S. has a personal wealth of about $6,000 compared with a white household of $110,000. The schools in many of our cities are appallingly underfunded. Violence is rampant on the streets. So many places where our African American brothers and sisters often live are dangerous places. A few years ago, I came across a memoir called Grace Matters that made clear to me how comprehensive and yet how subtle what we call white privilege has been. Chris Rice is a young white man from Vermont who decided to go become part of an interracial Christian community in Jackson, Mississippi. He left college to move there and stayed for 17 years, a time of hard work and personal struggle as whites and blacks attempted to bridge the chasm between their stories. Chris became close friends and a partner in ministry with the charismatic African-American leader, Spencer Perkins. And their candid exchanges explored the hidden corners of race relations. Chris came to see that his immigrant ancestors traveled to America by choice. Spencer's had come in chains on slave ships. Chris's relatives had passed down from one generation to the next financial capital, networks of friends, a stable family life, and solid places in society. Spencer's ancestors had no money and almost no possessions. Their families were torn apart by generation after generation of slave trade. And even after slavery, they had no vote and almost no chance of getting out of indebtedness to white landowners. His grandmother had died of malnutrition in a sharecropper's shack. And his father, the distinguished Christian leader John Perkins, had been beaten nearly to death by a white policeman. Part of my privilege, Chris Rice declares, was that for me, dealing with race was optional. I could take it or leave it. I could cross town into a white world and for the rest of my life probably wouldn't have to deal with race again unless I chose to. He said no white person has to do anything to continue to enjoy the privilege of being white. But his friend Spencer, he said, has to deal with the everyday struggles of race, whether he wants to or not. Producing 2 IDs to cash a check, worrying about being pulled over by police for nothing, knowing simply walking down the street could frighten a woman walking alone. Reading Chris Rice's book, I saw in a fresh way the fact that I have been receiving affirmative action all my life. From the stable family I started with, to the better funded public education than my black neighbors received, to the friends and connections that smoothed my way to school and work, to the ease I have applying as a white man looking for a job. Affirmative action for African Americans has been controversial over the last 40 years. But why should only whites receive affirmative action? The authors of this report had given us an important gift. It summons us to look at the dark side of our past and who we are now, to acknowledge the ways our parish and a great many individuals failed either to recognize the evil or to do something about it. But we look back not with a sense of our own clarity and self-righteousness, but out of our common share in the evil done on our behalf. We need to hear from the report of the ways that many Bostonians, including Trinity parishioners, benefited greatly from the slave trade. How many owners of New England garment factories depended on their slaves that worked the cotton fields of the South and who in fact opposed the Civil War. We need to know that in a city bustling with abolitionists in the 19th century, there is no record of any Trinity parishioners among them. And we also need to know that Phillips Brooks was a great admirer of Abraham Lincoln and an abolitionist, especially in his early ministry. And to jump ahead to the 1950s, we need to know that Henry Knox Sherrill, who was rector of this parish, became Bishop of Massachusetts, presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, and then president of the National Council of Churches. This great man was a tireless advocate for civil rights and desegregation, especially in the early 50s. And we need to know that there have been major key associate clergy at Trinity: Sam Tyler, Tom Kennedy, William Barnwell, who were tireless in leading Trinity into the heart of the city. As we go forward, we will need to ask ourselves, what steps are being called for us to make our response to this report? Some 5 years ago, in an historically black church in Philadelphia, the presiding bishop led a public service of confession, repentance, and resolve in response to our church's troubled history regarding race. We at Trinity might be open to doing the same. We need to be able to say that we're sorry. That we're sorry that our brothers and sisters of Trinity Church didn't see, didn't act so often, didn't stand up in the face of such evil, and we need to offer our own confession of failure, that we are sorry for our own blindnesses, past and present, our own failures to see and ease the burden of injustice here and now. You see, the way out is back through. Forgive us, Lord, for the evil done on our behalf and for our own failures to speak and act in the face of racism. Love your neighbor as yourself, Jesus said. Let the truth-telling and healing begin.